It's more useful to think of pseudoscience as being a cluster or a constellation of pseudoscientific warning signs, so that trying to unearth or describe something as pseudoscience becomes more of a probabilistic endeavor.
I'm Nathan Maharaj. This is Kobo in Conversation. My guest is Jonathan Stea, clinical psychologist and adjunct assistant professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Calgary. And the reason he's here, we're not just recording a therapy session for myself, he's the author of a wonderful, insightful, eye-opening new book called Mind the Science: Saving Your Mental Health from the Wellness Industry. Jonathan Stea, welcome to Kobo.
Thank you so much, Nathan. That was such a gracious introduction. I appreciate that. Thank you. And yeah, no therapy sessions for anyone, including myself, today.
Well, I thought the intro was mostly disclaimer, but I'm glad it was taken well. I want to start kind of at the end, because in this book, there's a section at the very end called Mind the Takeaways. It's full of some really good nuggets of how to debunk all kinds of things. It would have made a really great stream of Instagram posts. Maybe it still will make a really great stream of text Instagram posts. But with those nuggets in hand, with your demonstrable ability to do that kind of thing, why write a whole book?
Yeah, that section I actually took from my Instagram reels and from my social media because I found that they were sort of digestible nuggets that I really wanted to put out there for people to get. And yes, I wanted to kind of add prose and story around it and kind of weave story and science so that people can really understand the messages that I was portraying. But I found that, that section is super important, and I really wanted to have it in the book because I think it's sort of I mean, as I even mentioned in parts of the book, I wish that for some of those sections, people could even memorize them or have them in their back pocket, so to speak, because I think that in part what I'm trying to do in the book is to teach the language of pseudoscience and the language of pseudoscientific grift and alternative medicine ideology and narrative. And that section of the book, I think, gets at it in a very punchy kind of way, where I'm, for example, shining a light or exposing various alternative medicine tropes, which are just repeated ideas or themes that we see in alternative medicine ideology. And same with anti-psychiatry. The anti-psychiatry movement has its own set of tropes, and I think it was important to kind of just lay them out in sort of a checklist style. And then same just with basic. I have there's one section called Nine Red Flags or Nine
Mhm.
Warning Signs of Pseudoscience, and that's what I mean by having people memorize or have the merit of memorizing those things, because I think that when we have those warning signs or red flags in hand, it better prepares us to strengthen our grift detectors, so to speak.
Well, I'm glad you took us there to the imperative to make sure people have an understanding of the language that goes on in this area. Because I wanted to ask, how do we define then? How do you define wellness?
It's a nebulous term,
Yeah.
wellness. And so, yeah, I mean, I spent a good part of the book just trying to unpack what that means. We know that, wellness is an industry. It's a, $5.6 trillion industry right now. The term as we use it today was first coined by Albert Dunn, or first used by Albert Dunn in 1959 in the Canadian Journal of Public Health. He tried to define wellness as he made the distinction between freedom from illness versus high level wellness, which is
Mm.
more like an optimal functioning in someone's environment, living with wellness. And so I actually think that that definition was quite thoughtful. And to me, it was reminiscent of the distinction that we often make in the mental health world between mental health and mental illness,
Mm.
whereas mental illness is a kind of psychopathology or mental disorder. Something's gone awry, and it's become extremely distressing and debilitating, requiring treatment or care, versus mental health, which is a different kind of thing. There's overlap, but mental health is more about kind of rolling with life's punches and cultivating coping skills and living again in a with high quality life, living with purpose, living with meaning, meaningful relationships, meaningful pursuits, productivity, and leisure. And so I think that's what Halbert Dunn was kind of going for when he first coined wellness. The problem is that wellness, that definition that he had didn't stick, and it quickly kind of took a life of its own. And nowadays, you ask one wellness guru what they mean by it, and you'll get a different definition from the next. And so for me, when I hear wellness nowadays, it's really just kind of a red flag,
Mhm.
because it's been really, I found that it's become the wellness industry is really the commercial home for alternative medicine and the alternative medicine industry at large, which is really just an approach to healthcare that is really predicated on pseudoscience, pseudoscientific approaches, and as I mentioned, there's this alternative medicine ideology or narrative, which really aims to sow distrust in mainstream medicine and evidence-based care more broadly. And I think that's very dangerous.
Mhm. Well, that leads me to my next question of lexicography. What's a grifter? Because you do define it. You come out and say it in this book, so I was hoping you could define it for us.
Yeah, it's a funny term, I suppose. It's a grifter is a charlatan. It's a someone that's looking out to make a buck off the backs of people's health. Essentially, it's a snake oil salesman. That's another term that's been used.
Hmm.
That term, snake oil salesman, derives from uh, Clark Stanley in the late 18th, 19th, 20th century, where he was selling snake oil liniment. It was actually as a cure-all for various health conditions. It turns out that it didn't work. It didn't actually even contain snake oil. It was just sort of again, just sort of a pseudoscientific treatment that didn't work. It was pitched as a cure-all. And so nowadays, I think snake oil salesmen never went away. Now we see modern era grifters, whether it's a wellness coach or a wellness consultant, or a other just sort of there's other various legally non-protected titles which could
Hmm.
take the form of a grifter. Like, some people might not be aware of this, but even a therapist or mental health clinician or a counselor, under various, depending on your jurisdiction or country, those may be what's called legally non-protected titles, which basically means anyone can call themselves that, set up an Instagram page or hang a shingle on their lawn, like my mother could do that, or my friend, without any qualifications or credentials, call themselves a therapist and sell you anything to treat your depression, your anxiety, your post-traumatic stress disorder, or your addiction. And so, in that sense, that's what I mean by a grifter. It's sort of a charlatan, someone trying to sell a false bill of goods. And I suppose it gets a bit more complicated than that, because inherent in the addiction is that there's some sort of malice involved, that people are actually intentionally trying to con people. And I think that certainly can be the case. Um, Worse though, it is in worse is what I think is the fact that I think that the vast majority of people who are in the wellness industry kind of trying to, again, sell pseudoscientific approaches. I think that the vast majority are actually really caring people who are just trying to help people and earn a living. The problem with that, though, is that, even if they have good intentions and even if they think that they're doing the right thing, the selling of pseudoscientific approaches remains unethical. And the reason it remains unethical is because it can do a lot of harm to people. And so I would still classify that as grifting, even though people may not necessarily be out to con people maliciously.
You brought up the problem with protected terms. I mean, you were saying therapist, but as I understand it, even a precise term like psychotherapist, um, in Ontario where I am, it means something pretty particular. It means you have been through training that meets the standards of a college board that licenses you, and you can lose the license by practicing something other than psychotherapy as it is understood to be practiced as an evidence-based form of mental health care. But you're in Alberta, and I think it only just became a protected term.
It's in the process.
So right now, if I were to suddenly move to Alberta and just go looking for a psychotherapist, I'd probably find it easier to find one. But that's not because Albertans are necessarily better served by the field of psychotherapy. Do I understand then that that would be a function of the term being one that anybody can self-apply.
That's exactly right. Yeah. So currently in Alberta, it's in the process of being regulated, but it's currently not regulated. My own college, the College of Alberta Psychologists, is trying to take on that endeavor, and it's a very, to my understanding, sort of a cryptic process. No one quite knows what's happening there. But as of now, yeah, anyone can kind of set up an Instagram page or a shingle and say they're a psychotherapist, and that's really concerning because, as you mentioned, like the function of a regulatory body is to help protect the public. That's its mandate. That's why we have credentialing and qualifications and licensing. So that's a super important thing. What blows my mind about this, though, is that it can get even weirder, so to speak, because there can be, and I mentioned this in the book, there can be bona fide pseudoscientific professions, what I would call them, that do have regulation. For example, naturopathy or even homeopathy in the province of Ontario. Homeopathy is the only province in Canada where it's a legally protected title. So you need to be licensed and have a college to call yourself a homeopath. But homeopathy is quite literally one of those crystal clear examples of pseudoscience. There's lots of gray zones when we talk about this topic.
Yeah.
Homeopathy is not one of them. It's very, very crystal clear. Um,
As crystal clear as the water cure it prescribes.
that's exactly right.
Can you explain just for a second though, for folks who don't know, what is homeopathy?
Yeah, because it's absurd once people figure it out, because it can be found in Shoppers Drug Mart in various aisles, and people often confuse it. They think it means something like herbal medicine or some sort of natural approach to health, but it really doesn't. It was, invented in 1796, I believe, by Samuel Hahnemann, in Germany. And so it's not even some ancient kind of, that's another way it's pitched, some sort of ancient cultural approach. It's not. It's German from 1796. And basically, what it comes down to is it postulates this idea of there's a couple principles, but the one that's most absurd is this idea or principle of the law of minimum dose, which basically means that you take an active ingredient in something and the homeopathic approach is to dilute it to the point of diluting it out of existence, so that not a single molecule left of the active ingredient is in your remedy. And the reason that they do that is because from the homeopathic perspective, the it becomes more effective with successive dilutions. So it's like dropping, a Advil tablet, say, in the Atlantic Ocean.
Yeah.
Like you're not gonna, there's no molecule left in it. And so quite literally, at the end of the day, homeopathy products are just water, or they're just adulterated with things like alcohol or sugar pills. They really have nothing in them. And so that's why it's absurd. And it kind of gets even weirder because from the homeopathic approach, they believe that the water somehow has memory, but it's called homeopathic water memory, where the water remembers the ingredient that was in there and that's somehow therapeutic. So again, this idea is just divorced from mainstream pharmacology, chemistry, physics, everything that we kind of know in modern science. And so that's why it's a clear case of pseudoscience. And then that's really concerning that we have government legislating and deciding who can be a homeopathic practitioner, and they will purport to treat any health condition. If you go Google homeopathy for anything, you'll find it, from cancer to COVID-19 to post-traumatic stress disorder, etc.
As you described it, what is clearly a pseudoscience, if water has a memory, I think any of us who are living with indoor plumbing should be very concerned. Because of how the water leaves our house. We'll just leave it at that. I think we can put those things together. But there's a lot of language in there that gives a flavor of, it's not, if not science, we'll call it scientism. It's confusing. How does one draw that line between science and pseudoscience?
It's such an excellent question, and it's been debated for centuries. And so, and first, I'd step back and say, like you mentioned, like that, the laws, like that language of science, that in and of itself is one of the warning signs of pseudoscience, because it's basically pseudoscience, in short, is kind of dressing things up as science. It's fake it's fake science. It's pretending that it's science. That's sort of a shorthand definition, but as
It's science as karaoke.
exactly. I love that metaphor. And that's what that's in short what it is. And again, the reason it's been debated for so long, though, is because it can get complicated. This is an active area of, philosophical research and philosophical dialogue. There's a whole, history and philosophy of science. That's a whole branch of, that's a whole branch of literature that's been trying to solve the very problem that you mentioned. It's called the demarcation problem, which is where do we demarcate or draw the line between science and pseudoscience? And I think for our purposes, and for my book's purposes, I found that what can be really helpful is to understand that there is no clear cut criterion that can tell one from the other, but rather it's more useful to think of pseudoscience as being a cluster or a constellation of pseudoscientific warning signs, so that trying to unearth or describe something as pseudoscience becomes more of a probabilistic endeavor, meaning the more warning signs that we see and that we hear, the more likelihood that we've, again, unearthed something pseudoscientific. And so back to your initial question with the mind, the takeaways section in my book, I've listed 9 of those kinds of warning signs that people can look out for, one of which is using what's Timothy Caulfield's a friend and colleague of mine. He coined the term science exploitation, which is basically dressing up languaging using science sounding language to sell pseudoscientific treatments. One of my favorites is, the word quantum, because that's been a huge buzzword now in the wellness industry. If we see anyone using the word quantum and attaching it to a theory or explaining this is why their pseudoscientific approach works, I think that that's a huge warning sign for people to run the hell away, because
Mm.
the legendary physicist Richard Feynman once said, if you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't. And the reason for that is because quantum mechanics is super complex, super counterintuitive, and it's very obscure. But it's that exact obscurity of which that lends itself perfectly to, again, grifters to sell their pseudoscientific wares, so to speak, because it can be confusing for people. And in part, I think that's why we need to, again, learn this language of pseudoscience and also just try to increase our science literacy skills, because if we know just enough about quantum physics, just to say that quantum physics is really complicated, then that in and of itself may help us protect against a grifter trying to sell us a treatment based on quantum physics, because the chances are that grifter doesn't have a PhD in quantum physics.
You write in the book that if we believe in science, then we're doing something wrong. Can you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, what I meant by that is it sort of gets at the scientism idea. That's another kind of term which is often thrown around, which is sort of belief in science. You see it nowadays in the anti-vaccine movement and by, conspiracy theorists basically trying to again sow distrust in mainstream healthcare. And mainstream science. Basically, they're trying to say you can't don't believe the science, it's all wrong. And so I guess what I'm trying, that statement was sort of a reaction against that, because it's in part true. We're not gonna this the scientific spirit is really about not believing every single thing just because it's in a scientific journal or because it's couched in scientific language. Really, the scientific spirit is about being skeptical
Mhm.
and putting our, critical thinking hats on and trying to evaluate claims and in particular health claims through a scientific lens and trying to see, were these claims appropriately evaluated using the scientific method. So we're not believing all of the results because the scientific spirit is to essentially challenge the results and to try to prove yourself wrong. That's really what the scientific spirit is about. At the same time, I'm trying to help people push back against the conspiracy narrative, because just because we need to remain skeptical doesn't mean that we know nothing and that science knows nothing. And so we do need to cultivate a balance between healthy skepticism and trust in expertise. And that's what I was trying to go after. So, the random dude on social media that is going to challenge, the flu vaccine and say that it's all, BS and that it's more harmful than helpful. Well, you know, that goes against the scientific consensus, and I would urge people to trust the expertise in that sense, meaning trust credible sources like the World Health Organization and what they have to say about the flu vaccine rather than Uncle Bob.
or a podcaster with a multi-million-dollar deal, Uncle Bob
Even
or that guy.
even worse, yes.
Which does make me think of skepticism as a quality. Um, uh, it'll take you a certain distance, but you also warn about pitfalls of taking it too far. I think you alluded to that just now of the idea that um, being modest about what we can know, but not overly modest and not despairing of the idea that we can know anything. Can you talk about those kind of species of skepticism?
Yeah, because science is, again, by definition, it's an evolving endeavor. We don't know everything, and this is where it comes into, I guess, my title, Mind the Science, is essentially a play on words. It's a call for people to pay attention to the science, and particularly using the word mind is to pay attention to mental health related science. And so, I guess to answer your question, it kind of goes back to, say, our mental health related science, which is we don't fully understand everything about mental illness and mental disorders and how to best help patients and how to best treat patients. And that's an okay thing. I mean, we would love to be able to get there, but it's just an unrealistic goal. And so that's what science is literally trying to do. There's people literally dedicating their careers, and this has been going on for a long time, that are, working away in their labs tirelessly trying to push the science, so to speak, forward to increase our understanding of these things. And so what I mean, back to your question, is that, well, we can't put a 100% faith in all of our findings because science is by definition an evolving process. We're trying to approximate the truth with better, higher quality scientific endeavors. That said, that's a reality. And on the other hand, what we see in, say, the wellness world or the alternative medicine world, and even the anti-psychiatry movement world, is that they will take that kernel of truth, the fact that we don't know everything about mental health related science, and they will create a straw man fallacy of that, meaning they will. It's almost how propaganda works. It takes a sliver of truth and it overgeneralizes it and blows it up to say that just because we don't fully understand mental illness and how to treat it, then the narrative goes, which they'll use, we know nothing about how to treat it. And not just that we know nothing, but they have the solutions and they know how to actually address, say, depression or anxiety by selling, again, a pseudoscientific approach or a treatment approach that doesn't have any science to support it whatsoever.
Mhm. And that really is the sleight of hand, isn't it? Is saying, hey, these guys over here are willing to admit they're wrong. Therefore they're wrong. And by the way, over here, I've got some supplements to sell you.
Nailed it. That's what it is.
Oh, I'm closing the interview. I'm going to go open up a website selling supplements. I've got this down.
It's very lucrative.
Why is it harmful then for people to pursue unproven treatments? Like, what's wrong with pseudoscience? Maybe I'm a little dehydrated, and some homeopathy wouldn't be so bad for me.
That's right. If the goal is to hydrate and that that it's water. And so I think and that really speaks to some of the harm is that there's so much deception in the advertising. I mean, if someone actually were to sell homeopathic products and to say, well, really, this is just a placebo. This treatment doesn't work beyond placebo, and that there are better, more evidence-based treatments out there. You have the patient autonomy or the freedom to choose, then go for it. But that's not what we see in the wellness world. We see that this product can treat your cancer and glaucoma and your cat's anxiety and your post-traumatic stress disorder. And so that's one of the harms. But to categorize it, what helps me at least categorize it more broadly is, I like to think of pseudoscience as being harmful in at least three ways. One of which is that it can actually cause direct harm as a result of the treatments used. And I have a number of examples in my book where that could happen. It can actually, in rare cases, result in death, which are some examples that I've highlighted. But more commonly, it can actually worsen mental health symptoms and health symptoms. And there's an entire kind of literature on that, kind of harmful psychotherapies and kind of harmful treatments. So it can cause direct harm. There's another category of harm, though, which is it can cause indirect harm, which is just basically meaning, again, this ideology or what the wellness world does is it deters treatment seeking from evidence-based care.
Mm.
And so when that's happening, people are watching their wallets dwindle and they're wasting a lot of time and money and resources on non-evidence-based treatments and pseudoscientific treatments. And in my mind, that's financial exploitation and it's emotional exploitation. And while they're pursuing those other treatments, their mental health symptoms could be getting worse or their health symptoms could be getting worse. And so that's another category. And then the third category that I like to talk about for how pseudoscience is harmful is really just at the societal level, which I think we're really seeing right now is sort of, when a culture kind of elevates and tolerates pseudoscience in its culture, I think ultimately it undermines public health efforts. And I think we saw that in the COVID-19 pandemic, where the anti-vaccine movement was really trying to undermine the rollout of the vaccines. We saw the wellness world capitalize on that by trying to literally sell detox products so you could detox from vaccines. And I think that we're really seeing that now, not to get too political, but we're seeing that now, especially in the US, but also in Canada, but especially in the US and the far right, when you see guys like Trump merging with RFK Jr.'s whole, again, anti-vaccine movement and health campaign to make America healthy again, which is again there's a lot of pseudoscientific and misinformation roots in that campaign.
You write about something that does work, or is we're told it works, cognitive behavioral therapy. It's kind of the gold standard of psychotherapeutic treatments, or at least it's the one that insurers are most friendly towards. Speaking of financial incentives and that dynamic, you write, and this surprised me. You write that it should feel like a smooth conversation, and I think some folks have had experience with CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, and between the homework and maybe the clinicians like emotional distance because they are assigning you homework, it can be surprising to hear someone say it should feel like a conversation. Can you tell a little bit about the background of CBT, what it's supposed to achieve, and how do you engage with a client to make it feel like a conversation?
Yeah, that's such a great point because I think, yeah, lots of people can purport to do CBT, but the experience there can be wide variability. And I think that we see this in all kind of areas, I guess. I mean, you can have good and bad family doctors, good and bad psychologists, good and bad restaurants, right? And so you can have a therapy that is evidence-based and it can be done wrong. And the way in which it's done wrong, like you said, is this very robotic. Here's a bunch of worksheets and homework. Here's a lecture on how CBT works. It's supposed to, it's a connection between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. And now go out into the world and do it and then come back and report back. And, it's this very robotic thing. And I've been supervising clinically, I've been supervising students and residents in the clinical psychology program at the University of Calgary. I've been doing that for a decade or so. And, they, well, they're smart students, but they come with a lack of clinical experience. And so that's
Mhm.
something that they're looking for is, well, how the hell do I actually do the therapy? How do I make it a smooth conversation? And that's what clinical training is all about, because as you mentioned, it should be a very human enterprise. It's the merger of art meets science, and it's having clients or patients essentially being and what I mean by art is that a patient is the expert of their own experience, and good clinicians and good psychologists will pull that out of patients and co-explore problems together to produce ultimately psychological change. And so I suppose to answer your question, CBT is um, one evidence-based treatment approach that is supported for a variety of mental health conditions, from depression and anxiety, from addiction. And so I do use that all the time. But good clinicians and good psychologists know that you can think of a pie chart when you think of, what helps a person, and, specific treatments, what we call specific factors of therapy, like CBT, are only a sliver of the pie. There's another whole huge section of the pie. Some authors argue that it's more than 50%, is what we call the non-specific factors of therapy. And so these are things like cultivating a therapeutic relationship with people, expressing empathy, validating someone, having them feel seen, having them feel heard, cultivating motivation, encouraging new ways to change behavior and to bring awareness into their life and reflect on their patterns and to change that patterns. Those are what's called non-specific factors, and that's where that free-flowing language or conversation kind of comes in, and we're actually, as psychologists, trained to do that. And so CBT should be delivered through the medium of the therapeutic relationship, and that's sort of what I mean by having a smooth conversation.
There's a course that you mention in this book, and you describe it as one in which students are taught how to sell pseudoscience using the most effective methods currently in practice. But you mention it because you say you wish you'd taken it. Why do you wish you could have taken this course on how to sell pseudoscience?
It's a fantastic course, and it's put on by Melanie Tracer King, who's an associate professor of biology, and she's a wonderful science communicator. And she has a website called Thinking is Power, and that's her course. And she actually teaches that to undergraduate students in the US. And so, yes, I wish I would have taken that course because, again, it's doing in part what I'm trying to do with this book is to, again, teach the language of pseudoscientific grift, not to go out and to con people, but to better protect people from those cons, and to better help people make informed decisions about their health and their mental health more generally. And I think that it's unfortunate because a lot of those ideas, in part, let me backtrack. There's a guy named Scott Lilienfeld, and I mentioned him a lot in the book as well. And he unfortunately passed away several years ago. And one of my biggest regrets is actually not reaching out to him because he's sort of one of my intellectual heroes and academic heroes because he devoted his career to trying to help people spot pseudoscience, especially in the area of psychology. And what I've tried to do, again, in part with this book, is try to popularize much of his ideas, because I think that was super important. And I actually didn't get taught much of that during, I mean, forget my undergraduate years, I wasn't taught that, but even in my graduate years, in the master's and dissertation or doctoral dissertation days. So I think we can't afford to have these ideas, which are kind of well thought out, become lost relics of just, stuffed away in the ivory tower, so to speak, in academic papers. I think we really need to have them go mainstream, and that's what I'm trying to do because wellness is mainstream, and we need to have, I'll use the term again, grift detectors go
Hmm.
mainstream where people can protect themselves from that. And I think that that course is one way to do it, and I wish I took it.
What then ultimately made you pursue this career in psychology?
I thank you for asking that. I was wrestling with, and so in my undergraduate days, I went to the University of Toronto, and I didn't know what I was going to do. I found philosophy fascinating, and I found myself in the philosophy of science. So it kind of comes full circle. And I was taking philosophy of science. It was really hard. I was taking medieval philosophy. I found that even harder. And I figured like this stuff is cool, but it's challenging. And for me, I don't know what I'm going to do with it because I don't want to end up being a professor of philosophy, which is a wonderful thing, but I just didn't think I had the chops for it. And so I wanted to do something I found the philosophy of science compelling, and I wanted to basically do an applied science where you can use science to help people. And that's how I stumbled upon clinical psychology, which is, again, a rightly scientific discipline which tries to use science to help people who experience mental disorders. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Mhm. You write in the book, there's just a brief section about family life and what drove you, not just from an intellectual level, but sort of it feels mission driven for you of caring for your mother. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Yeah, when I was growing up, my mother, which and I wrote about this story in the book, my mother she spent more time in hospital than at home. She really had what's called a chronic pain condition that's called complex regional pain syndrome, which is really an umbrella category for a whole bunch of pain symptoms, which mainstream medicine hasn't quite figured out. We don't fully understand the nature of it and how to best treat it. And so, yeah, when I was growing up, I got to watch my mother and my family experience the the unguided trek through the healthcare systems of trying to get adequate care from both mainstream medicine and also alternative medicine. We literally tried everything. And I think that that experience, well, number one, it kind of woke me up to the fact that we do have gaps in our knowledge, and I can really empathize with people and my own patients where, we do have these gaps in our knowledge and we're not able to help everyone, and even, our cutting edge best science and best evidence-based treatments aren't able to help everyone, and that included my mother. And so it's understandable why people turn to alternative medicine because desperation to have our health conditions treated is very intoxicating. Who the hell doesn't want their health conditions treated? And it's normal and
Mm.
understandable to seek that elsewhere. And so I experienced that firsthand. And a lot of the pushback that I get on social media in doing this kind of work is that I don't understand that. And I would beg to differ because
Mm.
I think I do. I do personally, and I also do it professionally because, again, as a clinical psychologist working full time for over 10 years, I'm also not able to help all of my patients, and I empathize and I get that. So, yes, it is very mission driven in that sense, is in that, and I try to make it very clear in the book that this is not about shaming or blaming anyone for seeking alternative. That's a very natural response. My beef is with people exploiting those gaps to sell false hope and potentially harmful treatments by, again, exploiting those gaps and that emotional vulnerability and that financial vulnerability by, again, pretending that they actually do have the solutions to help people. And I think that that's very dangerous. And so, again, my this mission, the driver for the mission is just to have people become more skeptical so that they can just better be positioned to make informed health decisions.
Mm. How do you thread the needle in this, third decade of the 21st century to balance cultural sensitivity with alternative understandings of healing, of what people need to feel well, with your professional integrity, your commitment to providing care that scientific method has offered in this moment as the most effective, which you are of course willing to evolve with as it goes. But you you probably don't want to steamroll people's heritage, but you also want to heal them. How do you thread that needle?
It's a balance and it's a tough and I'd say one is that to some extent I don't even have a choice, and this kind of goes back to regulatory bodies because the provision or the practice of evidence-based healthcare is baked into the codes of ethics and the legal standards of practice of bona fide health professions, including psychologists, social workers, physicians, psychiatrists, etc. And so what that means is that we have an ethical duty and a legal duty to practice evidence-based care. That said, there's another thing baked into our codes of ethics and legal standards of practice, and that idea is called cultural competency. And this is the idea that ethical providers strive to fully or to be sensitive to their own values and their own biases and how that can affect uh, the patient experience and their care. They strive for knowledge about the worldviews and the values of their patients, and they practice in culturally relevant ways. And so that's it. that's an active area again of scientific literature, is trying to figure out how do we best adapt evidence-based approaches in culturally sensitive ways that make sense and that that are helpful. And so that's one part of the balance. And it is difficult. And so, but that's again, that's part of what bona fide health professions do. I would say the other side of the coin, though, is again, part of the wellness narrative and that alternative medicine narrative is that they're doing that cultural competency piece when in fact they're not. And in fact, there's several authors that have written about that. And I think that what we end up seeing is this term Orientalism, which is sort of this cherry picking or romanticizing aspects of either the Eastern world or just kind of global cultures more generally. And they're basically misappropriating those cultures and selling their pseudoscientific approaches under the guise of these things. And you could see it in the wellness world. You can go on to Gwyneth Paltrow's Goop website and find a Ayurvedic 3-day reset cleanse, or you can go onto Kourtney Kardashian's Poosh website and find a Ayurvedic asparagus recipe, or you could find James Arthur Ray, who I wrote about, I think it was in chapter 6, who is just a wellness guy who was doing sweat lodges and misappropriating indigenous healing practices under the guise of wellness, and he ended up killing people as a result because he didn't have the appropriate cultural training of indigenous elders. And again, he was doing it to essentially grift. So I think that's another needle that needs to be threaded, is that yes, evidence-based healthcare providers need to practice in culturally competent ways, and it's very difficult to navigate. At the same time, watch what wellness grifters are doing, because they will say they're doing those things when in fact they might not be. Again, and the other example is pitching, say, homeopathy as some sort of cultural ideal that we should respect ancient cultures by selling homeopathy. But again, it's German, and it was invented in 1796.
What drives you now to show up for work, showing up for your patients? What's the fire in your belly that makes you turn up for a day's work?
I love the clinical world. I think that back to that idea of a therapeutic relationship with someone, I think that's a relationship that is unlike any other kind of relationship. Obviously, it's not a friendship, it's not a romantic relationship, it's not a business relationship. It's something very different. It's a therapeutic relationship, which is where people get to come to you and share everything about themselves, open up in a really vulnerable way. And they'll often tell you things that they've never told anyone before, maybe due to deep-seated shame or guilt. And your job there is to sit there and to co-explore that pain with them, and to try to figure out a way to heal and move forward using the science as kind of your tools. And I find that process extremely rewarding, and I will never be bored of that, because it's a privileged experience to have. And that's my day job, and that's what I love the most. My book was an attempt to help people in a different way, in a role that I'm unable to fulfill in the role of clinician, where I could help people again protect against pseudoscience and misinformation in a different way, because I'm not necessarily doing that in the role of clinician. It's a different experience.
Jonathan, thank you for joining us.
It's my absolute pleasure, Nathan. Thank you so much for having me.
I have been speaking with Dr. Jonathan Stea, author of Mind the Science, Saving Your Mental Health from the Wellness Industry. Find it at Kobo in Conversation's home on the web. That's kobo.com/conversation. There's a link in the show notes. Subscribe in your podcast player to catch every episode. And if you enjoyed this one, tell someone who you wish well, but actually well. Kobo in Conversation is produced, hosted, and edited this week by me, Nathan Maharaj. Thank you for listening.